Hey, welcome to 12-Tone Building Blocks, our monthly series about the fundamentals of music theory. We've been talking a lot about how to use chords. We've talked about how they work and what jobs they can do, but so far we've only been looking at chords that are actually in the key you're writing in, and that's a tiny fraction of the number of chords out there, so what happens when we start to stray? This is going to be our first look at non-diatonic chords, which is just a fancy word for chords that aren't in the key. It can be a pretty challenging concept, so we'll start with probably the simplest version, modal interchange, also known as modal mixture. Either way, this is just borrowing chords from another scale. For instance, in this progression, all the chords are in F major. There's nothing weird going on, just plain old functional harmony. But if we change this to a B flat minor, suddenly we've got a problem on our hands. We're still mostly in F major, but with one chord that belongs in F minor instead. This sort of borrowing gives us a cheap, easy way to add a bit more color and intrigue, but how does it work? Well, as with many things in music, it's all about the balance between surprise and familiarity. You're not expecting to hear a B flat minor chord, but once you do, you can still relate it back to the root. The minor scale is pretty common after all, so it's not hard to see where the unusual sound came from. Okay, so that's why it sounds good, but how do you use it? Well, if you've watched our previous videos, then you know the biggest question is probably about chord functions. These are the various jobs that a chord in a key might do, but what about chords not in the key? Can they have functions too? Well, fortunately in this case the answer is simple. Yes. For the most part, borrowed chords have the same function that they'd have in the scale you stole them from. In F minor, the B flat minor chord has subdominant function, which means it introduces some instability to help lead you away from the root, and when we borrow it in F major, it does basically the same thing. In fact, probably the most common example of modal interchange is when we're playing in minor, but then we use a 5 major chord to give ourselves access to dominant function and a real sense of resolution. This happens so often that many theorists don't even really consider it modal interchange. Instead, we tend to just view the 5 major as part of the minor key even though it's not in the scale. Or, okay, technically we made new versions of minor to include it, but the point is this is such a common practice that I'm honestly a little surprised whenever I encounter an actual 5 minor chord. Beyond functions, another use of modal interchange is smoothing out dissonance. Diminished triads are really unstable and they can be pretty unpleasant if you're not looking for that sort of sound. If I play a descending line like this, that 7 diminished sticks out like a sore thumb. It sounds nasty, but we can't skip it or that smooth bass line winds up with a hole in the middle. Can modal interchange help us out here? Well, in minor there is no 7 diminished. Instead we have the flat 7 major, and swapping that in instead gives us this, which I think sounds a lot nicer. We can also use this in minor, replacing the 2 diminished with the 2 minor that we borrowed from the major scale. One thing to be careful of though is how the borrowed chord interacts with its neighbors. Let's look at the progression from earlier. Here we have a B flat minor triad with the notes B flat, D flat, and F, but right before it we have a D minor triad which has another F, an A on top, and a D natural. These two different kinds of D clash a bit and they make our borrowed chord stand out a little more. If we set it up with an A minor instead, we don't have any issues and it feels a little bit smoother. It's not like you can't use that sort of clash though, I actually think it sounds good. It draws a spotlight to something that you're trying to highlight anyway, but whether you want it or not, it's worth keeping an eye on. Anyway, that's the basics of modal interchange. If used correctly, it can pretty much double the number of chords you have access to in any given key. It's not something you want to use too much of necessarily, or you start to sound like you're just playing in a different scale, but if you use it sparingly, it's a really easy way to add some depth without too much complexity, which is nice because we're going to be getting into some pretty complex things soon enough. Until then, thanks for watching. Building Blocks was made possible thanks to our patrons on Patreon, so if you want to see more stuff like this, please consider supporting. You can also check out our store, join our mailing list, like, share, comment, subscribe, and keep on rockin'.